So yeah, I'm going to use Menti, and I'm sorry because I know we're probably all overwhelmed with Menti at the moment, but it's one way in which I want to kind of like share some quotes, share some ideas, and get you to kind of feedback. This is not a lecture in any way, shape, or form. It is an entirely interactive session, so I'm hoping that everyone can engage and give their thoughts. I've been doing these kinds of sessions for a long time now, and they work best, I think, when we just have a dialogue together and think through some stuff. So if everyone wants to either get it on their phone or on a separate browser, if you want to log on to that Menti, it'd be really helpful if you do that now, if you've not done so already, and then we can go from there. And if I move that, you'll still be able to see the code at the top. So my name's Chris Lloyd, my pronouns are he, him. I'm an associate professor of learning and teaching at the University of Hertfordshire, which is just a little bit north of London. And at the university, I have two main roles. Half of my time I teach literature in the humanities department, and the other half of my time I'm a learning and teaching specialist, where I help lead some of the diversifying / decolonizing / maybe we need a new word, which I'm hoping today you'll be able to help me think through a bit more. And this is some of that work today. And I want to talk about a couple of texts in particular, and that really comes from my literature teaching. So that's me. But before we do anything else, I just want to know how you are today. Most of you might have already been online for a session or two this morning, so I just want to check where we're at emotionally. It went high at the beginning and then it started sliding down. Okay, it's nice to know how you're feeling, because this work, I think, and hopefully this has been talked about already a little bit, like thinking of the work of decolonizing is we are entirely implicated in it, right? In our full selves, emotionally, physically, intellectually. That involves all of us being in a space. And I think our emotional kind of texture is an important part of that. So if at any point in this session you want to duck out, or you want to turn your camera off, or you want to come back on, like, please do. If you need to go use the loo, like, just go. This is a free open space. So in this session, as I say, it's going to be interactive. And by that, I mean, I just want to hear your thoughts on lots of the prompts that I'm going to gesture. And you can do that by putting your hand up, and you can come off mic. You can put yourself in the chat. There'll be space on the Menti as well to put thoughts. So there's various ways in which you can engage. But it's always nice to hear people's voices if you feel able to do so. And we're going to talk about two essays, really, or use those essays as prompts to do some thinking. And one is Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor from 2012. And then Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House from 1984. And there's a few reasons why I want to do that, but these essays to me have been really influential in my thinking, and I don't fully know what to do with them, I think is my initial prompt, right? Like I've read them, I've reread them, I've annotated them. What I do with them, how I work with them in university spaces is still a question mark in my brain. I want to know what you think about that. So this space is definitely a safe one. So I want everyone to, even though it's been recorded, I know it's been recorded, like I want you to feel safe enough to say the things that are complicated, thorny, difficult to work through. There is no judgment here. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about. And I want to kind of just like hold that space for us, right, across the next little while. And that's partly me not talking as much and enabling you to talk too. It's often the case that we talk about positionality of these things, right? And again, that's another word that I'm still grappling with. Far too often, I think when people talk about positionality, they just describe themselves. But I don't know if description is enough, right? Like one question here is, should I, as a white cis man, be running these sessions, right? Like what is my implication in that? What kinds of power is circulating by me leading it? Yes, I might be queer. Yes, I might have purple nails, but like, does that change anything? Probably not. How does my race, my gender, my position in the university, right, associate professor, means something? What does that do to this discussion? Does it change the way this discussion might move? So I want to kind of hold that open, and I wonder what other people think about that too. We might get into that. And my kind of disciplinary background is feeding into this too. So I'm a kind of American studiesist by training, which means I'm very kind of fluid in my interests in texts, right? It'll be literary one day, it might be photography the next day. We borrow from different kinds of theory. And that openness has served me well thus far. But I also want to see what happens when we bring that material to different kinds of spaces. So that's my kind of idea for the session. If at any point you've got questions, just raise them. So a quick check. Who has read or not read the Tuck and Yang essay? Okay, while people are voting, Kat has put, I've seen positionality statements on PowerPoint slides from some people. How do you feel about that, Kat? Are you willing to share a thought? Okay, well, if you want to type, if you want to have a type, that statement feels very neutral, but I feel like you've got a thought about what that means, just kind of putting it on the slide, right? Like whether that's just a kind of flat statement. Okay, so more people than not have read the Tuck and Yang essay. Okay, interesting. Second, has anyone read the Audre Lorde essay, The Master's Tools? Okay, this is interesting. We never know how this will go, right? Sometimes I'll go into a room where everyone has read the material and that changes the discussion. Okay, this is also interesting, right? So there's a reason it's usually my white colleagues who do. Okay, yeah. So like, what does positionality do, right? I've seen the same critique against scholars in perhaps North America, Australia, when they talk about their kind of landed position, right? Like, I'm standing on indigenous grounds, and they'll name it and then carry on talking, right? Like, at what point does the naming, the kind of articulation, just become performative rather than materially important, right, in the discussion? To what extent are we just doing this by rote rather than kind of grappling with what that means? And there's a quote from the Tuck and Yang essay that we'll come to in a minute that's about what am I doing here in this space? So we'll come to that for sure. But these are some of the kind of questions, right, that I'm thinking about in this decolonizing work. Like, how do we think more carefully about what decolonization means? For me, as a literature scholar, primarily, I get very nervous about language. When certain words become repeated, circulated, institutionalized, I get itchy, right? Decolonization is one of them. Intersectionality is another one of those words. I don't know if other people have these words in their world. If you want to put them in the chat, if there are words that get so endlessly repeated that I worry whether their meaning is still attached somewhere, right? When anyone at my institution says intersectionality, I say, shall we have a chat about Kimberly Crenshaw? Have you read Kimberly Crenshaw? And people are like, oh, no. Social justice. Sense of belonging. Hina, that's a big one right now, I feel. I feel like belonging has been maybe like the past 4 years, perhaps, maybe even less. Belonging has become the word. I don't know whether you want to come off mute and talk about that. You're very welcome to.
Yeah, I'd just say that it's a phrase that I've not been in higher education for very long, maybe about 2-3 years, but the sense of belonging has been ramping up. Everything relates back to sense of belonging. But as somebody that came from outside of higher education into higher education, I was just very confused by what do you mean? Because for me, belonging seems very like I don't know, it doesn't have a positive association. Now I more understand, but then what the institutions are trying to say, that students should feel like perhaps mattering is a better word, that students should feel like the and then I read an essay about that, but the term belonging and sense of belonging, just there's something about it that I still feel uncomfortable about, and I think it perhaps is because I've been learning a little bit more about what multicultural it started off as assimilation and then multiculturalism, and part of me feels like this might just be a rebranding of trying to maintain a status quo and putting it on the students that you should be belonging to this institution. And then there's also what does belonging mean? Does it mean that you wear the university merch? Is it mostly capitalism rather than actual students mattering to the institution?
Yeah, is it mostly capitalism? That is a fantastic quote that I think we could talk about a lot. Yeah, that really strikes me. Thank you for sharing that. Mushrat has put multiculturalism is still assimilation. It is capitalism. Did you want to share anything, Mushrat, about that?
Yeah, my mic's not working too well, so I don't know.
Oh no, it's good. You're good.
Yeah, so I've been immersing myself in this for a little bit. The whole decolonizing versus inclusion, etc. And the word, I've been reading Arturo Escobar regarding pluralism rather than multiculturalism, in that we don't have to try and, get into each other's business. We can exist separately, and every now and then we come together when interests converge, or there's something we need to do together, but to respect that we have differences, and those differences is all right. We don't have to look like each other, have the same faiths, have to do the same thing, even learn the same way, even teach the same way, even speak the English language the same way. We can just coexist, and every now and then our paths intersect and we interact and we get to know a little bit more, understand a little bit more, this push to always, got to get into each other's cultural business, is not necessary. And that whole thing about cultural competency and cultural humility, it's about humility, respect, difference. You cannot understand everybody's culture. You can't be competent with everybody's culture.
Interesting. Manohar, I don't know if that's how I say your name. I apologize if I've done that wrong. Has written there's one position, that's one position others would disagree. Multiculturalism has always been defined in different ways. But I think that's maybe it, right? Like lots of these words have so many definitions and they're used in so many different ways and contexts that sometimes I worry, right? One person's inclusion or belonging is another person's exclusion, right? Like belonging to what is always what I'm interested in. Like, do you have to belong to the entire university? But what does that mean, right? Like, how does one belong to entire? Do you only have to belong to your program or your course that you're studying? What if you just want to? What if you don't want to belong to your course and you only want to belong to your friendship circle? Yeah, reminding people how terms used very, very differently upon the context. And yeah, I think that's part of what I want to kind of dig into today with decolonization, right? It's a term that has become so broad to maybe include so many things that has that word then lost any kind of like orientation. So that's kind of one, that's the first question on that slide. Like, how do we think more carefully about all of this stuff? Second question is a bigger one. Like, can we actually decolonize a university? Is a university the kind of structure in place, an institution that could be decolonized if we use that term in different ways? Like, is that even possible? I waver on this. We can come back to this one. And in doing so, like, and this is the Audre Lorde essay that we'll come back to, like, are we using the master's tools to do so? And we'll kind of unpack what that means in a bit. And then the fourth one is the radical work that we need to do to kind of undo colonial legacies possible within the structures that we're working in, right? Is it possible to work in an institution like a university that is inherently white, right? In all of its kind of meanings, is it possible to do the radical work that we would like to do? These are questions that are on my mind all day long. So when I get asked to do a workshop for the business school on decolonizing, I'm like, okay, I don't know where to start with this. Yes, there's lots of questions I've got. The Tuck and Yang essay, if people haven't read it, is called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. I would really suggest everyone goes away and reads it after this. It's a really significant essay. It's in a journal called Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education, and Society. And in this essay, Tuck and Yang, who are both Indigenous scholars working in North America, really from line one take issue with the way that decolonization as a term has been kind of used, turned into a metaphor, been made to signal any old project in the university, right? From social justice to inclusion to feminism to and so on, right? Thanks, Mishra. Decolonizing is contextual, it's not an endpoint, but ongoing action because racism, discriminations, and disadvantages are never fully eradicated. Right. How many times have people in this room heard someone say, I have decolonized my curriculum? As though it's endpoint in the past. And I say, huh? Let's talk about that. So yeah, Tuck and Yang in this particular essay are really stressing that decolonization as a term has a very specific meaning in their context. And they say, and this is the quote on the slide, the easy absorption, adoption, and transposing of decolonization is yet another form of settler appropriation. When we write about decolonization, we are not offering it as another metaphor. So the absorption, adoption, and transposing, so all of the ways in which that term has come to mean other things or dropped into different other contexts, they argue is another form of settler appropriation, i.e. settler colonial societies are picking up a term that means something very specific to indigenous people, primarily the return of land. And by return of land, they mean the full return of land, right? The dismantling of states, the dismantling of territorializing projects. When we pick up that word and use it to mean changing a syllabus. So I wonder what people think about this quote. How does this strike you in any particular way?
I mean, I think it's a great topic to discuss. It's in order to I always feel like in order to solve a problem, you've got to admit the problem in the first place. So the fact that this is even coming up as a conversation, it's acknowledging that some people are using it as a buzzword. Having said that, I also believe that those that will use it as a buzzword will always use it as a buzzword. You mentioned something and I laughed when you said that certain people might say, oh, we have successfully decolonized the curriculum, or we have achieved cultural competence. Everyone is culturally competent. There is no end point to it. So those that will use it as a buzz point, as a form of tokenism, they will continue to do so. However, that word also, it opens up for those that will use it not as a metaphor, but as something active. It also serves its purpose. It's almost like yin and yang. It goes hand in hand. Those that will use it as a form of tokenism will do so. But for those who will use it and see it as an active word to start a change, they will use it for that purpose.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So you're saying, like, no matter what language we use, people are gonna use that language for different ends. Thank you. Shreya.
Yeah, hi. I was just thinking about, like, even if you use the words like accessibility and inclusion, even that kind of puts like people in a certain category. Like, it's not I don't think that's the intention of when someone uses the words like learning accessibility or digital accessibility, something like that, or even inclusion. But like, just unconsciously having used those words constantly, we subconsciously or consciously put people in a box, like they have certain needs or they need to have like certain help for learning, or even with the English language, people who don't have English as their first language. I think that kind of puts them in a certain category. And I just believe using something like diverse or something like that in curriculum a bit more makes it like opens it up for everyone. So like, it doesn't put people in boxes, and just having a diverse curriculum or something like that is like including every culture and just making it diverse for every other people.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, these thoughts are great. And I'm looking at the chat as well. Thank you, Mushrat, for writing that. Lucy, you kind of put your hand up, and then I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
Yeah, sure. It's really interesting to hear what other people are reflecting on as well. And yeah, it's always like, I think previous person just said, I think the language is always going to get misappropriated for whatever reasons by institutions, and I think it's part of the decolonisation process to be constantly reminding and reinstating a case for what this actually means. And I think it's to be expected, because I think it's such a seemingly radical thing. It's an act of such radical transformation for the status quo, for the master's house, isn't it? It involves, if the true kind of idea of reparations and repatriation and restitution and all of these R's to actually happen, it's such a radical change. So I think that the people that are holding power, the settler appropriators, the white elites, will always want to try and dilute that word and keep that word for themselves, ourselves, whoever we are, to stop it from really happening, I suppose, to make it look like it's happening a little bit. So I think it's really important that these conversations are continually happening, and I think, and to call it out when what we're really doing is diversifying, and that's fine, but let's call it what it is. I diversified a reading list. I didn't decolonize my reading list. I just think it's just really important to understand fully what that means. So yeah, I really love this essay for that reason.
I mean, I might be jumping ahead of myself here, but like, why do we think people are more interested in calling it decolonizing my reading list? Is it because it's the buzzword? Is that like why not just say I've diversified? Does it sound not radical enough within the learning and teaching framework, right? I don't know. There's something interesting about that. Sorry, yeah, go on.
I could share my experience. Yeah. So my experience coming from, I always say not to share, but I fall into it. My experience comes from maternity care, providing teaching for undergraduate, postgraduate midwives. And when we did a project that started in BCU actually on decolonizing the curriculum, and that's what we called it. It came from the buzzword, we picked up on it. And what had happened was that historically in maternity care or in maternal care or in obstetric care, what you have in education is you have research that has been done primarily on Europeans. This is translated into text. When you have teaching, you have images of Caucasian people. The teaching is based on research done on white people. And in fact, the Royal College of Midwives, I think in 2021, they released a statement saying that we need to include images of people with darker skin tones, because midwives are unable to recognize what a bruise looks like on a darker person because they do not see it. So for us, it was about the education we've been provided is based and steeped in colonial roots. So in order to improve care and safety outcomes for women, we need to decolonize it. And it's quite interesting because when you talk about these things, when you talk about public safety, even though we decolonize the curriculum, we still have to provide care for all women, regardless of what they look like. So in effect, even now I'm questioning myself. Yes, we need to decolonize the curriculum, but we can't do it at the expense of removing the color, if you see what I mean. But yes, that's what it means to us.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so many things to unpack there, but Mushrat, you go. I'll try not to comment on every thought, but yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, just coming, I didn't get the person's name who just spoke now. Apologies.
I think it's Olamide, or Olamide, I don't know how to say your name.
Olamide, thank you. Yeah.
Olamide, yeah. Do you know what? There's a misconception about decolonizing. Decolonizing says go to the most difficult, knottiest problem, right? And it comes from the intersecting identities that come together, as Kimberly Crenshaw says, that comes together to provide the most discriminations and disadvantage. Because if you can unpack that and work on that, then it will benefit everybody. Right, so that kind of care and understanding will benefit everybody. And there's quite a few examples around that. The latest one was from the Harvard Business School, where they found research that if you put black healthcare workers and doctors to care for the black population in this small study in America, they found that it absolutely improved the outcomes for the it was black men. And then they said that when you take what was happening there and just take it, widen it out, it actually improves the outcomes of other populations as well. So if you can understand the knottiest, difficult problem, it actually gives you a better way to widen it out to benefit all. And decolonizing education is about that. It's about what Bettina Love is saying, that, you know, you don't want your black and minoritized students to just be surviving, but you want them thriving as other students are.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, knotty problems. We'll sit with more of those for sure. And thank you, Manohar, for putting those definitions in the chat. And I think where this essay is interesting for Tuck and Yang, actually that first definition, right? Decolonization refers to the historical processes through which colonized countries and peoples achieved political independence from colonial powers. For Tuck and Yang, they would say that's not enough of decolonizing. Like for them, decolonization is even beyond that, right? And that's what I'm kind of interested in, that depending on who we're reading, who we're asking, decolonization means something quite specific and different. So even that kind of definition is really interesting for Tuck and Yang. They're like, yes, a country could gain independence from colonial history, but it might still be under neo-colonial rule, right? The land might still be owned by, you know, European forces, right? Like European nations might still be extracting all of its kind of mineral wealth, for instance, right? It still might be controlling how money flows in and out of that country, in which case independence is not enough, right? Like this is what these theorists would be saying, and I'm interested in these kinds of different definitions and how we grapple with this most kind of extreme critique, I guess, of the way the word is used. The other quote from them I wanted to share is this one. They say, decolonization as metaphor, this is what we're talking about, right? Like I've decolonized my reading list, or I've decolonized my there's another example, like we've decolonized our thinking is one they use. They're like, what does that mean? Do you just mean you've rethought things, or you've like grappled with new ideas? What do you mean decolonize your thinking? They say decolonization as metaphor turns it, the term, into an empty signifier to be filled by any track towards liberation. In reality, the tracks walk all over land/people in settler contexts. So for them, decolonization again is like so rooted to the settler colonial framework, right? Settler colonialism being where one kind of state power displaces an entire population, right, and claims that land as their own. That's what they're writing from as Indigenous scholars, that their entire land, heritage, traditions, and so on, and languages and people were taken over by colonial powers. And when decolonization means any kind of liberatory struggle, to Tuck and Yang, like when decolonization means any kind of gesture towards inclusion, justice, social justice is one of the things in the chat people wrote earlier. When they say when that happens, those tracks walk all over very material histories, right? That they are suggesting that we're not taking into account. Right, right. The kind of whiteness of education, the whiteness of, I mean, we can get into, if we had more time, there's so many things we want to get into, right? Like the subject areas we teach, right? If we teach in particular areas, are that like those subject areas are themselves colonial inventions most of the time, right? Like, what does it mean for me to still teach what's called English, right? The course that people apply for is English, not literature. And we know that that is an invented subject, right? To uphold and scaffold English, and that's at the height of empire. Like that's why people start studying English, to reinforce this kind of colonial power structure. What does it mean for students to come and study that with me now? like in the first week, I'm like, all I mean by English is like, you're going to be reading text in English, right? I'm not going to ask you to read another language, but it's baked into the very subject title that students go onto in UCAS. Like, can that be decolonized? Do we need to change the entire discipline, right? What would it mean to give up one's disciplinary boundaries, right? Like, but is that decolonizing, or is that something else, right, is the question. Tuck and Yang would say that's something else. That's not decolonizing. That is a different kind of project. So many thoughts here. So I want to maybe just take 2 seconds for people to reflect. There's quite a lot of people in the call that we've not heard from yet. So if this is a kind of anonymous space where you can just write any quick thoughts, I'll just give people a minute or so just to type anything about these quotes that they feel so far. Can be short, long, whatever you want. You need to read, learn, understand, and discuss before talking about terms. Okay, that's great. How often do we think this is happening in our institutions? How often are people picking up words and running with them without doing the homework, right? And that might not even just be in this decolonizing framework, right? In so many other frameworks. I believe it's all about liberalism. From structure and power, it could be good and bad at different contexts. Great. I teach the history of decolonization and colonization. It's always a good reminder how little people know and understand about these processes and ongoing legacies, right? Yeah, it is always striking how little people know and how baked into British society in particular colonization is. Shows how much work is still left to do. Land tracts being walked over, interesting to apply to British context too. Yes, and that's definitely something on one of my next slides. So I'm glad someone has written that. There is so much to learn and understand before being able to discuss them. Much more must be done, especially removing that mindset of viewing decolonization. Thank you. It's knowing who's holding power to enable and to hinder. Power is an interesting word as well, isn't it? In this session, I have power, right? Because I'm deciding what we talk about. I'm structuring the session. I'm moving us through when we need to. Would a fully, decentered session involve me not doing that, right? Would it be I pitch an idea to BCU and then when you all rock up, I say, okay, it's over to you. There's no structure here. Like, what does it mean? Where is power? Where is it baked in? How do we rethink it? These are some great quotes. Thank you for writing them. I really appreciate it. It's helpful for me when I go away after this and decompress all of the thoughts and some ideas. So like, interesting that people put this. So like the UK isn't really one of those settler colonial contexts, right? So when Tuck and Yang are talking about settler colonialism, how do we reckon with that idea in this country, in the UK, if indeed people are in the UK? I made that assumption, but maybe we're not. But like I am. I teach in the UK. When the UK isn't a settler colonial place, that colonialism in the UK was a different kind of gesture. It went elsewhere. What do we do with the idea that decolonization is, when it's used as a term, it's overwriting Indigenous histories, right? Is that even more of a problem, in other words, that the UK that doesn't even have that settler colonial context is still using it so kind of like broadly and widely? So that's one idea. I'll come to your thoughts at the end of this slide. Again, Tuck and Yang are talking about very specific histories of land, right? Very specific histories of place. And we could go, you can point to anywhere on a map, right? And talk about those kind of landed histories. And what does that mean? Like, it's like, this is a very material word for Tuck and Yang. And then the third thing that they're really drawing our attention to is the way that language and metaphor obscures real histories, right? Like, that's one of their key points, that language is doing some really dubious work, right? We want language to be useful, to be like productive, but they're like, great, when you're using language productively, you're ignoring certain things. So I don't know whether anyone has any thoughts on the UK context, what we do with that. And I mean we as a group here, but like, if you're based in the UK or not, what do we do? What do we do with UK history? UK has been complicit in settler colonialism politically, historically, and economically, right? Oh yeah, but I mean, when we talk about like, you know, if we were in the University of Cape Town, for instance, or if we were in the University of Minnesota, the university could give up its land, right? The University of Minnesota could be decolonized by giving away its land to the indigenous people that lived there, right? My university is in Hatfield. Like, what would that look like? Do you know what I mean? Like, how would that play out?
Perhaps it's oversimplistic, but for me, it goes back to power and it goes back to money. Some of the things I found it quite interesting what Dr. Was it Lushaba spoke about in Cape Town, and I need to go back to it for it to really sort of settle in my mind. But I just don't see it happening, and it's quite interesting because in terms of, for me, decolonization, we're talking about this now, this university is talking about this, BCU has put this on, this institution, one institution of hundreds of institutions in the UK has put this on. It is almost like this is an event in silo. People have come to this voluntarily. This is not something that has been seen as important enough to be an agenda that's gone up to Parliament, that has been filtered through. So it goes back to power. It goes back to money. Perhaps it's oversimplistic, but I mean, I don't see. You know, we talk about reparations. And I'm just gonna stop there.
Oh no, I was like, no, talk about reparations. I want to, but yeah, feel free to say more if you want to. There's no boundedness here.
Thanks. I'll stop because
Okay,
quite often
okay,
I'll stop because yeah, when I speak, I like to try to make my point, and my point is not going to be made because I would carry on. So I'm gonna stop there.
That's totally fine, but just, you know, just from my point of view, more than willing always to have those conversations. Lucy.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on that. Thank you for saying that, Olamide. Yeah, it's not, that's so important to recognize that it's not, decolonisation is not approached in any way in some kind of like systematic fashion in this country. Comparable to perhaps other places, Canada, New Zealand, where there is a kind of more state-led or state-sanctioned and supported pseudo attempt at that. You know, we've got the opposite here. We've got ministers saying, you know, this is not helpful, it's not necessary, no. You know, whatever, that's the government. But you just think even amongst universities as a network of institutions, and you think of what are the bodies that regulate us, you know, OFS, okay, we can't expect anything from them because they're government. But maybe Advanced HE, you know, they've changed recently. Advanced HE have changed the language in their professional standards framework from equality to equity. Yeah, they're still not talking about decolonisation, but that is I think quite a big shift in favour of, you know, thinking we need to have an approach about thinking about people differently according to context and histories. And I think that's coming through a little bit more, and it's making me feel a bit more emboldened to talk about decolonisation and other ways of rethinking our practices because of that. Yeah, so I think that's a really important thing to kind of think about. How can we do this more systematically? I think conferences like this obviously are helping because it's bringing loads of us together. You know, where I might feel it's like a siloed little discussion and it's just me and 3 other colleagues at my university. When we're together, it's like, oh, no, actually, look, there is a network of us. And I think, is it the organizer of this conference, Marie? I've got Melanie. That's just set up this new Decolonising network on LinkedIn. You know, it's brand new, past few weeks, and your podcast. You know, you just think there are these things, but it's no substitute for that state sanctioned. Right. But you know, I just think, oh, well, current government, we're not in a. I don't think we're in a place where that's going to happen right now.
Right.
Yeah, just hoping.
Right. Yeah. Kat said, can you post that LinkedIn group? That'll be useful. Advanced HE felt decolonizing contentious and have referred to the term internationalization. But even internationalization, right, to go back to that, like early, like that sounds like a business term to me, right? Like that's just, isn't that neoliberalism? I don't know. Like that feels very, I just like the idea that words are contentious too, right? Like we're working in a structure where even just saying a word is like, well, that's contentious. It's like, huh? Like we can't even grapple with the ideas because the word is already framed as such as being contentious, right? That always reminds me of Sarah Ahmed, who's wonderful. Obviously, her quote: "When you point out a problem, you become the problem." Right? Like to me, like I think about that every single day. Like as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, that makes sense, right? Like you point out the thing, and then well, now you're the problem because you've raised the thing. The thing isn't the problem itself, right? Racism, sexism, transphobia, whatever you name it. Like you are the problem for bringing it into existence, for like naming it as such. So yeah, but I mean, even like that's interesting, right? Even like the kind of state sanctioned models, right? Or the kind of centralized versions of like Canada or New Zealand, or this kind of we're going to explicitly, New Zealand is a more interesting example, I think, right? Where they're like, no, we're really going to foreground kind of Maori languages and, really kind of reframe indigeneity. Like that's a very top-down structure though, still, isn't it? Right? Like there's lots of debates there to be had of, yeah, really, really interesting thoughts. Did anyone else want to say anything about these things, about like what we're doing in this UK context? Because there's a few interesting points in the chat. Like the Manaher put, the UK may not be a settler context, nevertheless the working classes were equally subjugated in service of colonialism and empire. Great point. What would indigeneity mean in a UK context? Right, I mean, when you hear indigeneity in a UK context, that is usually used by the far right, right? Like when we hear white nationalists talk about indigeneity, like they mean a very kind of white version of the UK. So indigeneity becomes wholly kind of yanked out of any kind of context, right? But that's a really interesting question. If we can't give back land in this country, would it be about the kind of money question, right? Like Olamide kind of asked, right? Would the Tate company, for example, right? Would Tate Modern, Britain, Liverpool, St. Ives sell all of their paintings and artwork and give that money back to the places from which it extracted sugar and money and labor and land, etc. Right? Like that's how Tate got its money. I ask my students this every year. I'm like, who went to the Tate recently? If they have. I'm like, who is Tate? They're like, I don't know. I'm like, where have you seen that name before? And then we kind of look at a bag of sugar and they're like, oh. I'm like, yeah, how do you think they afford, like, where does this money come from? We know that the Great Exhibition made enough money to kind of build the Science Museum and the V&A, right? Like there was so much money from the Great, like, would that be a UK version, right? Like fully selling, would the British Museum have to give back all of its objects? Like these are big projects. Is it a class question? We may not be able to give back land, but a lot of the UK has profited from colonialism, right? So money, reparations. Thanks for that link, Lucy. I'll check that later. If I open it, I feel like I'm going to break my computer, so I might just copy and paste it. Modern British-born actors still own land in the Caribbean that still operates work on land, right? So we might need to be thinking more interconnected in an interconnected way about how colonialism is rippling outwards from the UK, right? Rather than the very specific context that Tuck and Yang is talking about. Okay. So another quote from them that I want to kind of like linger on as we kind of push forward, that they write that settler moves to innocence, and this is a term they come up with in this article, that like moves to innocence are those strategies or positionings that attempt to relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility without giving up land or power or privilege, right? So they say when people use decolonizing to mean any old thing, it's actually a way of claiming innocence, right? It's a way of absolving oneself from the structures of colonialism that one is purporting to resist, right? So they're saying that when an institution says we are decolonizing, like whatever kind of institution, a university or something else, that is a way of absolving guilt or saying we've been bad, but without doing anything material, without giving up land, without giving up power, without giving up money, without giving up privilege, without giving up status, right? It's a way of saying, look, I'm doing the work, but without any of the material basis to it. And that's interesting also in terms of who's doing the work, right? So they also write, in fact, settler scholars, and they're very explicitly talking about some American or North American scholars who are doing work in decolonizing. They say these scholars may gain professional kudos or a boost in their reputations for being so sensitive or self-aware, yet they only serve the settler, right? So here they're kind of really taking aim at those North American scholars who are building careers on decolonizing work, right? Who are getting promotions, who are getting grant bids, who are getting any number of professional accolades without any of the kind of material redistribution underneath it, right? So they're kind of talking about a double problem here. Like, not only is the word decolonizing being stripped from its specific context, it's now a nice buzzword that means you get promoted, but you get more money, right? Like, you get more money as a scholar for doing this work because you're seen as like, you can get grant money or you can get promoted or whatever. So that's interesting to me, right? Like, doing this session. I'm going to come back to your comment in a minute, Manaher. I've seen it in the chat, but I'll finish this thought while I have it in my mind. Like, what does it mean for me to lead this session, right? Like, what kudos or reputation do I get for leading a session, for being sensitive and self-aware, right? Like, oh, Chris is white, but he's like sensitive. He's like aware of the issues. Like, okay, but this is giving me kudos, right? I told someone I'm doing like this BCU session. They're like, oh my God, that's so great. I'm like, oh no. Does that mean I shouldn't have done this session, right? Like, should I have extricated myself? Should I have even applied? At the same time, I want to facilitate conversations like this, right? I feel interested in doing these conversations. So like, does anyone have any reflections on that idea about like who we are as scholars and what we might gain from doing the work? I guess especially white scholars, but not only. Does anyone have any reflections on that?
Sorry, I'm lending a lot of my voice and words here. I apologize. I'm not trying to take over, but I'm so passionate about this topic itself. I think we all are complicit. It doesn't matter if you're white. It doesn't matter that I'm South Asian. We're all complicit if we are not showing our what Dr. Dave Thompson calls work receipts. You know, when you go and purchase something, the proof of purchase is in your receipts, and it's about your work receipts, being transparent about what you're doing with your power and privilege, and how it's landing, how it's becoming impactful, how it's enabling that just change to happen, how you're sustaining it, who you're working with. You have to be transparent about all of this. So we can be very complicit and careerist, and I've seen that happen across the colour bar. So it doesn't matter. I know you mention you're white and that's a privilege and a power, but you're also wanting to do and be in the change work as well. And it's about how are we doing it? Who are we collaborating with? How are we transferring some of our privilege and power to enable those that are minoritized, marginalized, less advantaged than us to come round the table as equal accomplices to make the change happen. So we have to be aware of it, and when that challenge comes, we have to be able to answer it.
Thank you for those thoughts. Really great. I love this receipts idea. That's a really helpful framework, actually. Manahurst put, I'm not white, but I think somehow I'm in the same category by doing this work. Yeah, it's just it's again for me, like this idea of reflection. Like, are we doing enough reflecting? I don't know about you, but I am daily in back-to-back meetings with no time in between to even decompress on what the meeting was about, right? Like, not even 10 minutes to be like, what did we just do? What might I need to do next, right? About anything. Do we allow each other space within university settings to do that, right? Do we have time to just sit with an idea, to talk it through, to reflect on it? No. Why? Because it's not productive, right? In the kind of neoliberal framework, like it's not producing anything. But that to me is a big problem, right? And that's why these kinds of sessions are really interesting to me, because I love hearing other people's thoughts. Teaching literature, I usually just go into the room and I'm like, what did you think? Like, I was like, I've read this novel 12 times. I know what I think. I want to know what you think. And students are like, no, tell me what it's about. I'm like, no, that's not what this is. So any of these sessions, like providing space to do some of this thinking through is really helpful. If anyone has more thoughts on this, like, you can always get in touch with me anyway. Like, I'm hoping this is a ongoing dialogue, not just today. I was going to say this morning, but it's definitely not this morning. Which kind of shifts me and my thinking to this Audre Lorde essay, which again I've gone back to so many times, which is a speech she gives. And Audre Lorde she was a poet, she was a thinker, she was a philosopher, she was a writer. She described herself as like a woman, a mother, a lesbian, like so many things. And she's invited to this conference at NYU in the humanities in the 70s. And it's a conference about womanhood, right? It's about feminism. And she is one of 3 women of color who are invited to this conference. And the only panel on which these women of color are invited to talk about is something called the personal and the political, right? So she uses this moment to say, like, wait, did you only invite me here to talk about this because Black women can only talk about their Black womanness? Like, can I not talk on these other panels about whatever, like pay gaps or representation or any number of other things, right? So she uses that moment to really kind of like lay into the organizers and say, what does it mean for this feminist project to only be white, right? What is being done under the name of feminism through this white framework? And like, what is my role here? She also says, like, why were 2 of us only invited very late in the day, right? She's like, she takes explicit aim and says, not only did you invite us late, you then just shoved us on one panel. And the essay really kind of extends her thinking that she's written about in numerous essays and in her poetry too, that she says that racism, sexism, and homophobia, and we can add in other things there too, right? Ableism, transphobia, like we can go down the list, are inseparable. So really she's theorizing, along with the Combi River Collective, if people know them, like way before Crenshaw is saying intersectionality, Lloyd and the River Collective are talking about how power systems, power structures are interlocking, interconnecting, right, is the kind of language they use. That you can't talk about sexism without also talking about racism and also talking about classism and also talking about, right? She says there's no way that you can dismantle these power structures without dismantling all of them. They are all part and parcel of the same project, right? They are all, if we want to talk about it, the colonial project, right? As well as numerous other things. So in this essay, in this speech, really, she's kind of saying, and this is the line everyone quotes, but whether people reflect, I don't know, but it's like a big one. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Here when she's thinking like the master's house, like that word master, like she's using very particularly, right? Like she knows that is calling up both mastery in terms of gender, right? So she's talking about like masculinity and patriarchy and heteropatriarchy in particular. But she's also kind of referring back to slavery, right? Quite clearly, I think. Like it's clear that she's talking about like the master's house in terms of like the long legacy of the plantation, right? And what does disruption, dismantling look like if you use the logics, languages, tools, frameworks, ideas of that very structure, right? So in relation to this conference, she's saying, how can you have a feminist conference and explicitly exclude women of color and poor women and queer women? That is just repeating patriarchy in a different form, right? So to do feminism in her mind is like, if you're using the same ideology as patriarchy, you cannot dismantle patriarchy, right? You cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the thing that the master has already created, right? Like that's kind of one of her points. Like there may be mini wins, but like genuine change will never happen. Yeah, how do other people feel about this? Miriam.
Yeah, hi. It really made me think what you just said, but I think what has come up, and maybe slightly controversially, is something that was mentioned to me a little while ago about progress, perfection being the enemy of progress. And I know this is slightly controversial here, but what it also makes me think is that, you know, of organizing that conference that you mentioned, is that I think along the way we might be missing progress that has already taken place by saying it's not perfect yet, it's not how it should be. So I think I'm just saying that whilst I really get it, I'm still trying to, you know, get to the bottom of this quote. I also think that we might lose to celebrate, you know, initiatives and things where things are starting to go in the right direction, if that makes sense. So yeah, because if you say it's never going to be genuine change unless it is, you know, perfect. Sorry, that's how I'm reading it.
Yeah. Or if not perfect, like it's not going to be genuine change if you work within the structures already set up, designed to make you fail.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah,
right.
okay.
Like, can one dismantle something within the framework that's already been set up for you?
Yeah, that's
like
true.
how does one work with that, right? Like, because some people would say you can bring a institution down from the inside, right? You could like, so, you know, some people would argue that, right? You could like get on the inside, get in there on the ground, mobilize, work with people, and you can tear a structure down, right? And like we could say the history of unionization has done that, right? In certain ways, right? Like as one example. But then someone else will say, but the institution is still standing. Right, you may have changed things internally, but like, has it brought down the very thing that forced you to gather in that way in the first place? Jodie's, but yeah. I run into that issue a lot. People saying that EDI work shouldn't be done because it is using the master's tools. I totally understand, but it seems to leave in a very disempowered and hopeless place. Yeah, that describes how I feel often in EDI meetings. I'm laughing because it's distressing and repetitive. Jodie, did you want to come on to talk, or there's no pressure to, but if you wanted to say a little bit more, you're very welcome.
Sure, I can. I'm not looking my best today, so I give you my, but yeah, I feel like I keep going round and round in circles about this because I completely take on this idea that, I mean, I feel like I am rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic to some extent, but then if I don't do anything, then nothing gets better, and I don't know what to do with it, honestly. So I keep going, I feel like I'm going round and round. EDI is absolutely not decolonizing, but I often use that as a way in with management, because they will talk about EDI and they will not talk about decolonizing. So I kind of use it as a wedge, but it absolutely is not decolonizing. But I think I tend to feel like I need to make progress, but then I've been told that making progress is actually just reinforcing. So yeah.
Well, yeah, because the question is whose idea of progress, right?
Exactly. I think I see progress more in the like making my workplace not as toxic. But
Okay.
you know, is that better? I'm not just to me, but to people are telling me that actually it needs to be toxic so that we can actually revolutionize it. So
right.
I don't know. Yeah.
Right. And the question is like, is some change better than no, you know, but, or is the change only in service of a neoliberalized white capitalist, you know, like, is the change actually doing anything? Lucy, sorry, you've got your hand up.
Oh yeah, I was just kind of thinking, because we're talking quite broadly now about, you know, it's big just society, you know, life on the planet, and I'm thinking, and what does this mean if we bring it back to the university, and if the university is the institution or the master structure, which is fairly similar structure across the world, the university, and you just think, well, what are we beating the master at his own game with certain widening participation and equity initiatives that is allowing, that is temporarily allowing loads of people in and to gain and benefit from the social capital and mobility that will bring them to participate in the status quo neoliberal capitalist world, you know, and like, what are we talking about here when it says about that genuine change? Are we talking about the overthrowing of capitalism, which is not is one on different discussion perhaps of talking about decolonization, but I'm just always interested in that what is that meta structure that's keeping universities in operating in the way that they are, and of knowledge production. And I think of like Olufemi Taiwo's book, which I haven't read the whole thing. I've read bits of and enough of to start thinking, okay, the points that he's trying to make there is about, well, what is the disadvantage of imposing a decolonial mentality or ethos on others that may be like, well, hold on, can we determine how we want to play this, and how this might disadvantage us from playing the game? So I think it's an excellent quote to kind of lead us to thinking about very big things, but they're, well, quite very much a lot out of our control.
I've got so many thoughts, but Melanie, Marie, I know you've got thoughts.
I always have thoughts. Apologies. I was following the chat, but I wasn't able to join because there's multiple sessions happening. But and apologies if I'm saying something that's been said already. I love the discussion. This is the kind of stuff that I wanted from December. So thank you. I think, and it came out yesterday in the keynote, which I know many of you probably weren't able to attend. I think, so I'll throw the question out there. Leon said in the keynote, and I know some people have been critical in the literature of using, in attempts to decolonize, we are recolonizing, or we are using colonialism, or we have colonial mindsets, and therefore we're reinforcing colonialism in our approaches to decolonizing, right? We have to be open to critique and to difference and challenge in this whole conversation around decolonizing. We also have to be open to the concept of plurality, otherwise, in my opinion, it's not decolonizing. And the reason why I'm saying that is I still feel like in this conversation, we're coming at it from a very binary perspective. So we're still saying, are we decolonizing or are we not decolonizing? Are we being capitalist or are we not being capitalist? Are we being colonial or are we being anti-colonial? And in my own reflections, and I'm constantly trying to reflect on my positionality, I was saying it to someone earlier, I can't not be colonial in my decolonizing work. It doesn't mean I'm not decolonizing. It just means I am colonial. I was raised in a colonial education system. I was educated in a colonial education system. I was raised by parents who were extremely colonial in their mindset and still are in some cases. I was raised in a fundamentalist religious background, which was extremely colonial. And I was educated in large part in the Caribbean, but that was in a colonial system. And I was educated by post-colonial thinkers in a colonial system. And the system is colonial. The society is colonial, and so there's so many ways that we will perpetuate coloniality in our thinking and in our being. Then you've got the other side of it of being the reality of existence in this day and age. If you just want to feed your kids, you're going to have to buy into that capitalist structure. You know what I mean? If you want to have certain luxuries, you want to have a spa day, you want to have a nice car that's not breaking down every 2 minutes, you're going to have to buy into capitalism. So I think if we try to take a step back, and I think it was you that told me this in the last series, if we take a step back, and it's really helped me, because I would get kind of like, you know, the bird's nest going in my mind about how am I really decolonizing if I'm like completely bringing it to the ground and blah, blah, blah. You take a step back and you start thinking, actually, I can make a crack here. I can widen a crack here, and then constantly review your position and your own potential colonial mindset, even if it's, you're not saying anything out loud, but you're just thinking, oh my God, that was a bit weird, or where did that come from? If you're constantly doing that reflexive practice while trying to change things, isn't that also decolonizing? Versus being someone who's in a position to completely flatten the structure or completely eradicate the university, which we all know we're very, very, very far away from. You know, isn't that also decolonizing? And then there's also the question that we asked yesterday: can you be decolonial in your practice without saying it, without intending to be decolonial? Isn't it still decolonial if you're, you know, fixing the oppression that takes place in some small way? And how much can someone do it versus a collective do it? And how much does power play into this? It's kind of that thing of like, if our vice chancellor wanted to completely change the university, he has to be in a position of power to do it. So then does that make him not decolonizing if he's trying to decolonize but he's the vice chancellor? So I think I'm saying, can we try to kind of explore not these non-binary concepts of I am or I'm not, or I can or I can't, or I'm white so I can't and you're black so you can, and start thinking a bit wider about actually, can we have multiple points of entry? Can we have multiple ways of being? Can we have multiple perspectives? And sometimes those perspectives might clash and might disagree. Can we have EDI as the label, knowing that that's the only way to shoehorn decolonizing in, and then talk about decolonizing afterwards, or not talk about it at all? You know, it's that question of, do students even respond to the word decolonizing, or do they just respond to a better curriculum? You know, are you a better academic because you actually know the realities and the history of your subject versus a decolonial academic? You're just being accurate, right? So I'm just saying, maybe we think differently and try to really enforce that decolonial perspective of the plurality and the pluriverse, and move away from these things of you are or you aren't decolonizing. And that, I think that would feed into the master's tools thing. It's, well, yes, the master's tools, yes, the master's house, but actually my house, because I've made it my house. And, you know, he might occupy a part of it, or he might own the building, but I'm doing my thing here, and that's enough for me, versus someone else who wants to own the building, and they do, versus someone else who wants to own several buildings, but they use the buildings for decolonial work. I think there's so many ways that you can critique, but there's also so many ways that you can look at what's happening and say, actually, this is decolonial work. It's just not the same, and it's not all on the same level or in the same way. I'll shut up now.
No, like I've got 700 thoughts. Olamide has put, perhaps progress can be made by getting along, using what works and restructuring what does not, as opposed to starting from scratch. Really interesting. Like, so many of these thoughts, depending on how optimistic I am on that day. And I think I came into this maybe more pessimistically, because I was like, no, if you're a vice chancellor, you can't do decolonial work if you're on a six-figure salary. Like, that to me seems antithetical to decolonial practice. I don't know. Like, I'm on the more negative end of that right in this second. But your questions are really, I'm gonna go away and think about them for the rest of the day.
But if, even though he's on the six-figure salary, he came to our keynote yesterday, our vice chancellor. That doesn't mean that he's for decolonizing. Actually, one of the first things he said to me, and I don't really think it makes any sense, but he wasn't saying he doesn't want to do it. He was saying he's probably responding to a lot of the negativity or the ignorance or the political ignorance that surrounded it. But having a vice chancellor that comes to your decolonizing conference, not many people can say that happens. And I'm not saying that means he's doing decolonial work, but he's showing support for it. He didn't have to. And I think, yes, he's on a six-figure salary, but if he brings in more people of colour in senior positions to address, for example, our awarding gap, isn't that decolonial work? By making the whole university fixate on this problem that we have, that no other vice chancellor has. He's still on a six-figure salary, he's still a vice chancellor, but he has the power to make everyone talk about something that nobody else was talking about. And he only has that power. I can't do it. So yes, there's the capitalism, and yes, there's the reality of, well, surely he's buying into certain elements of it, but he's also trying to fix things that none of us would be able to fix if we weren't in that position of power.
Maybe you could run the university. Maybe you're going to be in charge next. Olamide, you got your hand up.
Yes, what Melanie holds a very special in my heart. I'll put my camera on so I can say hi. But yeah, I mean, what you said in terms of having those, it's interest convergence, which I've just learned about today. Having those in power, buying into something. I'm gonna take my camera off because I'm feeling a bit shy, and I'm gonna say something which I feel makes me perhaps a bit vulnerable. It was quite interesting, and you mentioned this when you started this session, Christopher. I don't know if you like to be called Christopher or Chris.
You've got me, whatever's fine, don't worry.
And my heart is beating as I'm saying this, but you came onto the screen, and this was, we all know what the session is about. And you said yourself, you said that you're a Caucasian male. And if we think about the picture the media portrays of the Black woman, we're on very opposite ends of the spectrum, complete opposite ends of the spectrum. However, you have come to facilitate the session. I have come in as a participant. You are teaching me, and according to society, what media portrays, they might say that you're not that person. Your image is not the kind of image that should be teaching me about what I need to know in terms of decolonization. If my mind is closed and I have a very sort of binary perspective, no, this is not the person to give me this information, I will miss out. And I'm not going to lie and say that when we started, I just thought, oh, interesting. And then I carried on. So by having kind of like, I think this is what Melanie was talking about, having this kind of more a broader and a plural kind of perspective, you can take in more. And by doing so, you are able to make changes where required in this. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Wait, I'm going to come out of a session. I'm going to be like optimistic. This is different from what I'm used to. Let me just say, usually I come away thinking, any number of things. The last one I did, I was told I think too much. So they're like, Chris, you think too much. Stop thinking about words. Stop thinking about structures. I was like, are we not higher educational professionals? Anyway, I'm realizing the time. So like, there's no way we're going to tie any of these threads together. But like, I really want to, the kind of questions that we kind of have started to think through, and I'm hoping we can continue this dialogue in various ways, right? Whether it be on LinkedIn, whether it be through whatever format, please do get in touch. I'd love to talk to you all more. Like we thought about the UK context of this decolonizing conversation, right? Especially in relation to the Tuck and Yang essay. There's very much about settler colonial context, but then we thought about how that extends outwards, right? That we in the UK are implicated in those settler colonial contexts, even if this isn't one. We've talked about what does dismantling the master's house, the university look like? And when universities were at the heart of empire, right? Like constructing, legitimizing, theorizing the colonial project. Like, how do we then remake them, transform them now, right? I've given versions of this session before, and people have, by the end, they're like, wait, so are you suggesting the most radical end would be to like completely get rid of the university? And I was like, that is one version, sure. And they're like, oh, what would we do? I'm like, I don't know. I'm just kind of posing ideas, but like what I'm interested in that we've talked through today is the kind of, gesturing towards the kind of radical end of things, and then sitting with the different kinds of gains we get, right? The kind of spaces we open up. I love that you said the cracks, Mal, of like opening up cracks. And it makes me think, I don't know, because we talked a little bit earlier about the Tate Modern. Did anyone ever see the Doris Salcedo exhibition at the Tate Modern with the crack that went through the turbine hall? So she's a Colombian, artist. And she made a crack through the turbine hall, which is like the main space in the Tate Modern. You can look at photos of this online. People fell in, obviously. Like, it's a tiny crack, but people, just like don't stand on it, but you fall in. And even when it's been replastered back over, right, you can still see the traces of that crack. And she wanted to make a crack in the space of the Tate Modern to say, this space is a colonial space, but I want to prise open part of it, right? I want to leave a mark in the floor. I want to try and break open room. Thank you, Lucy, for posing that. Shibboleth is what it's called. So that idea of the crack, right? Like maybe if all of us go away from this and we're like, I opened up a little crack in a meeting today, or in a structure today, or in a discussion today, or in a procedure or a policy or a regulation, or, you know, who knows what, maybe that, you know, more things can filter in, right? More things can like crack through. That's exciting. Okay, maybe I'm optimistic. I'm gonna go for a walk in the sun and think about all of your ideas. The last slide on here is like, if you've got any feedback, you don't have to do this now, but if you leave the tab open on your phone or whatever, you can come back to it later. If you have any feedback, it would be really lovely to have, for me to think through any questions that you might have. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for coming and engaging. And sorry, I'm just reading your chat. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking part, and I really enjoyed this dialogue. My brain is changed, so that's good, I think. But yeah, thank you so much.